Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Welcome back, everyone, to episode 15. I am very excited to be here with my friend, Kyle Brunelle. Kyle, say hello to my people.
What's up, folks?
Oof, that was a good one, Kyle. Sometimes we get lackluster hellos. That was a good one. I give you 10 out of 10. So as I start every podcast, the vast majority of my guests are my personal friends. And so I'm going to tell you how I met Kyle. Kyle is the other half of my main woman, Lex Lancaster. You've probably heard me talk about Lex before. She is my virtual assistant. She is beyond amazing. And in 2019, Lex and Kyle were traveling to Alaska to start Kyle, what do you call those things? Traveling PT, is that right?
Yeah, we were on our way to Alaska to start a traveling physical therapy assignment. And AZ was gracious enough to offer her own home for us to stay a night or two. So.
Okay. And it was beyond fun. And it was one of the greatest weekends. I think it was a weekend. My friend Zamia was here with us, Lex and Kyle. We did all the fun things. But if we're being honest, Kyle was a little apprehensive. He and Lex were driving here and Kyle's like, Are you sure? But then everything was great once he got here. Am I right?
Well, I mean, at that point, I didn't really know you. And I don't know if Lex really knew you that well either. And I was like, this lady's extremely nice. Maybe she's like going to kill us. No.
I mean, there's a really good chance that I could have been a serial killer, like 15 out of 10 chance, but I wasn't. And we had a great time. So I start every podcast, Kyle, with 3 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready, I think.
Okay. Kyle Brunelle, who are you?
I am a husband, a dog dad, and a physical therapist working with sports and performance folks and pelvic health.
Pelvic health. We're going to dig into that later. Kyle, what sets your soul on fire?
Education, both for patients and other clinicians. I love a good riff on really any kind of clinical or business topics. So education and really just yapping. So fitting that I'm on a podcast.
Yes. Well, and fun fact, if you know me, you know I do not stay up past 8 o'clock. And when Kyle and Lex were staying with me, I actually stayed up pretty late one night. I think it was almost 10 o'clock. And you know what we were doing? We were sitting around the kitchen table talking about performance and wellness and fitness. So yes, Kyle loves these things. All right, last question, Kyle. This is a tough one. How are you changing the world?
So individually with each of my patients, both for movement and sports performance, keeping them active and healthy and doing their thing, or keeping them from, peeing their pants when they're trying to do their thing. And then as a group, as a whole, kind of having a more broad impact, helping train other providers to do the same.
I absolutely am on board with everything you're saying. And I just made a note because I'm old and I forget things. Peeing your pants. We're going to talk about that later. Okay. I try to stay organized, Kyle. So first I want to start off. Your PT practice is unique. And actually you guys were building that practice during the heart of COVID, if I remember right. And so you actually treated me, and we live thousands of miles apart. So you treated me virtually, which was a new experience for me, but also it was quite successful. So tell us first about your PT practice, about Renegade, and then how do you actually treat people virtually? Go.
Yeah, so Renegade is an out-of-network practice, or a lot of people call it cash-based, meaning that patients are responsible for the financial part of their own care. The reason we did that is insurance sucks, and long story short, it creates a culture and atmosphere and environment where you cannot treat the people, well, at least for me, the people I wanted to be able to see and in the way that I wanted to be able to treat them. So largely, most PT clinics don't have barbells and dumbbells and the opportunity to spend an hour working with the person one-on-one, looking at heavy squats and heavy deadlifts and things like that. So those people I wanted to work with. So I got out of that real quick and created my own business. And yeah, I mean, it's I always joke with folks, like I wouldn't own a business otherwise. Like I'm certainly more happy being, this is maybe not politically appropriate anymore, but I'm happier being an Indian versus a chief. Although leadership also is something I'm not unfamiliar with, but at any rate, we created a clinic so that I could work with the folks I wanted to in the way that I wanted to help them. To that end, virtually sometimes is an option that I offer folks because not everybody lives right in my immediate vicinity, as AZ pointed out. And so, yeah, it's a great option. It allows me to get a bit more creative when I do see folks virtually, because obviously I can't put hands on. Obviously, I'm looking at a screen in 2D versus a person in 3D. So you have to get a bit creative. And also there's the constraints of what does a person have available to them. Now, when I was working with AZ, she has a whole like full ass gym in her basement. So it's pretty sweet. So that was easy. But yeah, it's cool. And it's a great option for folks because there might not be somebody who fits your vibe and can help you with the things you want to work on in your immediate area. And so if you're listening to this, that's a great option, whether it's, obviously myself shamelessly promoting, but, or somebody else that does the same thing that offers virtual options. That can be a great way to access care and work with somebody who gets you and can help you get back to doing the things you want to do versus seeing the local run of the mill, insurance-based practice.
I definitely try to talk less and listen more during my podcast, but I'm going to quick relate. I'm a big person. Analogies and metaphors really work for me. And so what Kyle's talking about, when you truly vibe with a healthcare practitioner, it makes a huge difference. I saw the same dermatologist for 10 years, and we had this understanding of how he was going to treat me and what kind of a patient I was going to be. And it was perfect. And then he sold his practice to a large, it's called Rush Hospital, a large hospital in the area. And so I was inherited by another dermatologist who I saw last year. And I couldn't stand him. Like, if we're being honest, I could not stand that guy. I made another appointment just because I felt like I had to. And when they called to confirm it for this year, I was like, no, I'm not going. So then I got on ZocDoc and I just started scrolling through, and I picked at random a practitioner, and I saw her yesterday, and it was like magic. It was like we were best girlfriends after seeing her once. And this is what you're looking for in practitioner. And so what Kyle's talking about is important.
Yeah, it's super important that you find somebody that vibes with you. And there's something for everybody. And that's why I think, like, in PT, there was a whole New York Times article that came out about this guy who had this, a knee injury or something. He's a reporter. He went around to all these different practices and he got all kinds of different treatments and approaches and treatment narratives and stuff like that. For like 5 different PTs. He got 5 different opinions basically. And he wrote this whole article, and it kind of, brought up this whole idea about like practice being individualized versus like, variations in care, basically is what came up. And the white paper that was wrote about it from our profession, the APTA, was like, oh, we have to get rid of this. And I was like, no, absolutely not. We should not get rid of this because every human is different. Everybody's an individual. And so my vibe and my biases are going to be great for certain folks and not so much for other folks. And there might be somebody else who is a lot better suited for the folks that maybe aren't, vibing with me. So it's super important that you find somebody who's aligned with your values and vibes with you.
Well, and when you go to, say, Burger King, you have an expectation from Burger King to Burger King. The fries should be the same. The Whopper Junior should be the same. But that's not what we want in our healthcare. We don't want cookie cutters in our healthcare because we want the opportunity, like Kyle said, to vibe with someone. It's so cool. Amazing. So from your perspective, Kyle, again, I don't want to be the one doing the primary amount of talking. So I was your patient. But from your perspective, can you just tell the listeners what that was like greeting me thousands of miles away on basically a camera?
Yeah. So really the only difference is hands-on to test things and hands-on to treat things. Now, for me, movement is the bias in my treatment anyway. So again, balance is good. Finding the middle and not letting the pendulum swing from one side or to the other side, extremes to extreme, finding that middle ground and that balance is good. Right. But for me, certainly movement is a bias. And I think most people come to me with challenges with movement. So I want to get them moving and being able to do movement again, because that's their original challenge. Right. So largely, I don't do much passive treatment anyway. That said, that's the only constraint you have with remote care, right? Is that the provider can't physically touch you. However, just like in person, when I do cupping or if I do like the grass and scraping tools on somebody, for instance, oftentimes in person, I recommend, and I actually have them available in the clinic for purchase. I have those tools for the patients and I teach them how to use it on themselves anyway, because autonomy is like one of my number one goals for people, and that they have ownership of their own healthcare in their own body. So as much as I can, like the only thing I don't send patients home with is like dry needling, right? Like that's invasive and can cause some problems safety wise. So outside of that, I'm teaching for folks how to use the same things I would use to them anyway. And then the only challenge might be like if it's an area you can't reach or something, right? So even virtually, you have options for manual therapy stuff, and you might just have to recruit a loved one or a friend or something, or do it on yourself with those tools. So really, that's the only difference, is that you can't touch the person. And even that, there's a lot of workarounds for, again, being able to get in. Like if manual therapy is going to be super helpful, you can certainly through a video medium teach folks how to do that, or teach somebody that they trust doing that with them how to do it for them as well.
Kyle, autonomy is sexy. I love that so much.
Yes.
Give a man, or teach a man how to fish rather, or a woman, rather than just giving him a damn fish.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, Kyle, you are maybe going to have to correct me because I've sort of gone off the rails on this thinking and I might be wrong. Earlier, you mentioned peeing your pants. And I know you are a pelvic floor specialist. That's kind of your jam. So again, correct me if I'm off base here, but I think firefighters might be a population that could suffer from some pelvic health problems. And here's why. We have these issues where we quite literally have to hold our waist. Say we're on a long job, we're on a fire, we needed to pee 6 hours ago. So we're literally holding our urine or our feces. Or the other end of the spectrum, people actually call it the safety pee. They go to the bathroom when they don't have to, just because they're afraid they're going to be on a fire for 5 hours. Also, I think maybe many of our female firefighters are coming back to work too soon after giving birth because they don't have enough time off. And I think there's just this whole spectrum of issues that might be contributing to pelvic floor issues. Can you just start giving us the information on pelvic floor? We'll sort it out from there.
Let me riff on that. So, number one, we have a podcast on the Renegade podcast as well. One of the more recent episodes that we talked about pelvic health, if they want to like a really in-depth one as well. But I'll ramble on a little bit about that. So pelvic health and the pelvic floor, for those that don't know, is a bowl of muscles that kind of bridges the gap at the bottom of the pelvis, like from your tailbone to like the front part, that pubic symphysis, basically where you'd sit on like a bike seat, right? Your perineum. Otherwise, there's no bony structures. There's nothing else there to prevent literally your organs from falling out your ass, basically, right? Cool. So that group of muscles is then very important for several functions. Support of all those organs, as we just mentioned, but certainly also stability, like manually the muscles pulling on the bones around largely like the tailbone, SI joint, and the pelvic ring. Sphincteric function. So again, keeping you from peeing and pooping yourself and releasing gas when you don't want to, stuff like that. Stability function, because it's part of the core canister. So imagine like your favorite, soda, seltzer, beer, wines now canned, I guess, too. Imagine your favorite can, and it has a 360-degree wall around the outside, and it has a top and a bottom, and it's pressurized. So the same thing's true of our core canister. The top's our diaphragm, the bottom's our pelvic floor, and the continuous sidewall is largely what we call our core muscles. And so it has a lot of function in regulating pressure and stability there as well. And then certainly it's important for not only bowel and bladder function, but also sexual function. So a super impactful area of the body. It's a group of muscles that's not just, oh, it hurts and I can't like lift things or move that body part. It's like it affects all of those different areas and all those different functions. Men have pelvic floors as well. And so I know the fire service is largely dominated by male folks, and they also might have a lot of pelvic floor challenges as well. But certainly also the females are likely to have pelvic floor challenges as well. So I kind of like joke, like everybody has pelvic health challenges until proven otherwise, because it's an area of our body nobody even knows they have, never mind is aware of, and never mind is doing anything for their own wellness. So think about if you had like if your knee was something you didn't know you had and you never did anything for it, therefore, and you never took care of your health and wellness of your knee probably would hurt and have some problems, right? We've never done anything to treat our knee. Well, same thing, but for your pelvic floor. So that's kind of some background there. Now, primarily people have several different challenges in that area. Incontinence, and that can again be urinary incontinence, that can be fecal incontinence, and that can be gas incontinence as well, which can happen with a multitude of different situations. So a lot of people are aware of like the, jumping or running or whatever else, and people leak urine notably, but certainly there can be strong urges and triggers that the urge gets so strong that people all of a sudden, again, then lose their control and have incontinence happen that way. Actually, incontinence can happen during intercourse as well. And that's called coital incontinence. So that's a thing that happens as well. And then pain can happen. There's a lot of different pelvic pain syndromes and stuff like that, but largely a lot of them happen during sexual activity. And some of them are maybe more occult. And this is the last part that I'll kind of mention here is hip impingement or any kind of hip problems. SI joint or tailbone, like low back type pain, things of that nature. Basically anything above your knees and below your neck, and maybe including your neck, can be linked to, or the pelvic floor can be even one of the causal or driving factors for that pain and those problems. And so that was kind of my why for getting into pelvic health, was the orthopedic side of things and how it has a huge impact on the core canister and everything from, again, like low back pain, rib pain, odd like flank and abdominal cramps, stuff like that, to like, again, femoroacetabular impingement, like pinchy hip type stuffs, and things of that nature. If we think about it, part of the pelvic wall is a rotator cuff basically for the hip, and it's your hip external rotators. And that's one of the main things that can cause challenges for, again, hip and low back stuff. And certainly is a leak or a gap in performance when we start thinking about kind of what the function there is. Again, think about it as a shoulder. If your rotator cuff wasn't functioning so well, not only might you have shoulder problem and pain, but on top of that, your shoulder function is probably not going to be optimized. You're probably not going to be able to, push as much weight overhead or bench press as much weight because you're not stabilizing the joint. So same thing, but for your hip. And so imagine how important your hips are for any kind of performance activities as well.
So much to unpack, Kyle. This is so good. First of all, we will link that Renegade episode in the show notes. Lex is going to be so excited. Go SEO. Also a quote that I know is going to resonate with my firefighters: the pelvic floor keeps your organs from falling out your ass. So good. It's so good. Well, here's the thing, Kyle. I think most of us are probably familiar with one and only one exercise for the downstairs, and that's the Kegel, because who knows, probably Jane Fonda in the 70s told women, and probably now men, that they should do Kegels. First of all, I know that is not even necessarily the right exercise for most people, but what other exercises could we possibly implement for self-care? Or do we absolutely need to be assessed before we start messing with this stuff?
No, you should absolutely just hit as many Kegels as you can, and that'll be super functional. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes, dude. Yes. I was hoping you'd say that.
Somewhere out there is a pelvic therapist listening to this and they're cringing because they heard just that first audio bit, but no.
Right.
Yeah, Kegels are very contentious. And the reason is, again, think about your bicep. I wish this was a visual medium for the podcast listeners, but hopefully I can do a decent job describing it verbally. Think about your bicep. So if you hold your elbow up and it's flexed to like 90 plus degrees and you're like really contracting your bicep hard, right? And it was stuck in that really shortened contracted position. If you then try to contract it more, probably that wouldn't be so useful. It might be helpful if you could get that muscle to relax and to get that full range of motion back for your elbow, right? To be able to fully lengthen things. So that's why one of the reasons why Kegels are contentious is because people oftentimes have a lot of pelvic floor tension and they're contracted at baseline and there's like holding an isometric all the time. And so that's not super functional for what we need the pelvic floor to do. And it'd be great if we could get that to first relax and fully lengthen, and then we can work on the contract, and then we can work on doing more like a concentric and an eccentric or a positive or a negative type contraction, right? And moving the thing through its full range of motion. Beyond that, we also have to consider that like there is both a power and strength function, but also an endurance function of the pelvic floor, because it is kind of supporting and doing its job throughout the day, all day, right? And so it has to have a lot of endurance, and that's why we see like 70% or so of the fibers are typically more endurance type muscle fibers. and about 30% are more like, fast twitch type fibers. So with that, we should train accordingly. And also, let's point out for Kegels or pelvic floor contractions, a lot of folks, there's studies that have been done, a lot of folks, even despite having great training aids and great education on how to do that, still won't access and connect to their body to do that kind of contraction accurately. And so what I see oftentimes clinically is people, like, I'll ask them to do a Kegel or pelvic floor contraction as part of the exam, and they actually just bear down and they're trying to like blow pressure down low because it feels like things are moving, right? Because that intra-abdominal pressure is pushing down on the pelvic floor. So things are moving, but it's actually the opposite of what we're trying to do. That's not a contraction. You're not actually even relaxing or contracting. You're just bearing down and trying to blow the barn doors open with that pressure. People there's a squeeze and a lift function there. People oftentimes will get one or the other. A lot of times people will have like one hemisphere, like one side will do better than the other, or maybe the front of the pelvic floor or the back of the pelvic floor will be able to be activated a bit more. So for all those reasons, it's kind of the same idea as if you said to somebody like, hey, I know you're not working out. I know you have like a tight like shoulder and pain there. Why don't you just go try some bench presses? And the person would probably not be largely very successful, because it's recommending one exercise for a complex multifactorial problem is probably never going to be a good strategy. That said, I do differ from a lot of my peers in that I will sometimes use contraction-based stuff to help with lengthening and help with relaxation, thinking about that as like a PNF contract relax, or DNS, or like there's a lot of different kind of techniques that we accept as like, strain, counter strain, muscle energy techniques, stuff like that, where you are contracting it and then relaxing it and maybe getting a bit of lengthening there. So maybe you go from like 70% contracted at baseline and things are super tense and tight to like 90% contracted, and then you relax and let go of that, and you get back down to like 60 or 50% contracted, and you can keep going through and eventually get more and more relaxed. Basically, you're just using the contraction then as a way for your body to feel like, oh shit, things were tight. Maybe I can relax and release some of that. And our body's good at measuring magnitudes of change. So think about like a temperature in a room. If it went from 70 to 71 degrees and it did that over like 4 hours, we wouldn't really notice that at all. If it went from like 50 degrees to like 90 degrees and it did that in 10 minutes, we'd be sweating our butt off and being like, what's wrong with this thermostat right now, right? So it can be helpful to feel one end of the spectrum to the other, or a max contract to a more maximal relax. And that can help our body kind of be more aware of what's going on in that area, bigger movements. And then we can start to fine tune that down the road. Also, the pelvic floor doesn't function in isolation for any of those functions. And so we have to then look at breathing, because that's going to change largely pressure and myofascial tension and a lot of other things. So we have to look at breathing and our core pressurization strategies, basically how are we pressurizing that can and when and why and what strategies we're using. We certainly have to look at hip strength. So that's another thing that like, hey, functional pelvic floor strengthening probably should include like, if a lot of that pelvic floor is connecting to the hip, as we talked about, and acting as a rotator cuff, it would be great if we strengthen that as a rotator cuff, and maybe even for dynamic, like weight bearing, closed kinetic chain exercises like squats, deadlifts, and single leg stuff as well. And largely that's one of the things that people are challenged with most often, orthopedically, is like, for instance, on squats, people's knees cave in and they're not accessing like their quote unquote their glutes as much. And so we put like a band around their knees. But the challenge with that is it cues more of an abduction, like frontal plane, in out type motion, as opposed to a rotational type motion. And so we access maybe glute med there with that band, but we don't access the external rotation at the hip using, again, that deep hip part of the pelvic floor. So you can kind of look at it from more of a movement perspective and orthopedic, and how do we like strength train in that way. You can look at it from like a breathing perspective, and how do we breathe and then pressurize our core and then use different strategies to maintain core stability throughout different movements. And you can look at it pelvic floor in isolation and specifically as well, and try to do things consciously controlling pelvic floor there as well, with the idea that that can help relieve symptoms in the short term, and also can help folks kind of find and be more aware of that area. And the hope would be in the long term that we can tie that into with other movements as well, and then tie that into, okay, now it's not conscious control anymore, it's more subconscious, and this is just our default strategy. We don't even have to think of it, it's more reflexive.
Kind of hearing, Kyle, though, this isn't a DIY. I can't probably just read a magazine article or whatever. I probably can't navigate this on my own. I probably do need to get assist. Yes.
That would be, I mean, I'm biased clearly, but even checking my bias, yeah, I think DIY is going to be, for most folks, most times, a less successful option. There is, I forget who actually put out this product, but it's called Pelvic Gym, and I'll have to send you a
Sounds
link or something.
kinky.
But
Be careful where you look this up. Sounds kinky.
yeah, you might find mixed results there. Safe search on. No. So the Pelvic Gym is basically put together by a group, like a consortium of other pelvic therapists and sex therapists and a few other allied healthcare providers and stuff. And it is kind of more of a DIY option. And they do even have, I think a lot of it is free content. And then I think there might be a membership that you might get access to other content as well. But I'm pretty certain it's called Pelvic Gym. But anyway, that would be a DIY option that I think, as far as my knowledge goes, is one of the best options. I know Move You also put something out, but I'm not super confident in. I haven't experienced that product, so I really can't speak to it. And yeah, no. So largely, Annette, you're correct in saying like I really would recommend getting a coach, and a coach would be a pelvic floor therapist. Now, there are kind of like 3 or 4 main archetypes of pelvic therapists. So there is the pelvic therapist that says they're a pelvic therapist, and you go there and they do work around the pelvis, right? On the outside, external only. And really, it's an orthopedic therapist that just is claiming to do pelvic. Then there is the internal therapist, but all they're doing is using biofeedback machines, and so they might use probes and sensors and stuff externally on the pelvic floor area, or internally, either intravaginally or intrarectally. But they're largely just like computer games and probes or STEM or something like that, right? Which, as it might sound, is kind of threatening and also probably not super functional to be playing games with your pelvic floor, and then that's going to somehow translate to like heavy squats and deadlifts. Probably not a thing. Then there are internal therapists who do manual internal examination, and they do a lot of manual therapy internally to the pelvic floor or externally. And maybe they might even do like Pilates or yoga based stuff, but largely it's a lot of like on table treatment. And again, still not bridging the gap and still not approximating demands, in my opinion. So that's a large percentage of my peers that do pelvic health therapy that way. And then there's folks like me who, if it's indicated and if the person wants to, and that's a whole thing as well. But if it's indicated and the person wants to have external and internal pelvic floor examination treatment, we'll do that. But also we have to put it in back into the context of, okay, well, how do we bridge the gap between what we're doing here on a table and actually standing up and then putting a load on our back and doing stuff? Or if you're in, like, for instance, the fire service, dragging bodies out of burning buildings, like how do we translate those things and how we bridge those gaps? And for that reason, I oftentimes, again, depending on the person, depending on their comfort level and whatever else, but I oftentimes will at some point do a pelvic exam in standing, and sometimes even with movement, because we want to know what's happening and what's functioning with your pelvic floor as we go from a gravity minimized, on a table position to a gravity engaged upright position, and maybe even a gravity engaged upright position with some demand, like squatting and deadlifting and hinging and lunging, all the things.
That to me sounds a little bit scary, and you definitely need the right person for that. And how do you sort this out? So you have these 4 archetypes of physical therapists. Is there any way to sort that out before you ever even see a physical therapist? Do you just kind of ask them, hey, are you the guy, or are you the physical therapist that treats me only on the table? Or, do you just ask them flat out?
So kind of things to screen for if you're considering engaging with a pelvic floor therapist and trying to work on your stuffs. Things to kind of consider as far as screening goes, so you make sure somebody fits your vibe, is like, okay, cool. What does their website look like? What's their social media look like? And what is their messaging if they have any other kind of content, and like email, newsletters, whatever else, podcasts, stuff like that, right? What is their messaging, and does what they're saying vibe with my own personal biases and opinions? Harkening back to what we said before about, like, again, making sure that the person that you're going to see, that provider, that coach, is going to be aligned with your values as well. So again, if you're somebody like me and you love movement and you're like really active and sporty, does the person's content look that way as well? So if like you go to like the Renegade social media, I'm like slapping barbells around and dumbbells and like doing crazy stuff all the time, right? So that kind of makes sense. That's aligned for somebody like me, as far as providers go. And that's why I see, again, the pelvic health folks I see are like doing Russian hard style kettlebell stuff, or Oli lifters, or they're like CrossFit athletes, stuff like that, right? Or runners or stuff like that. I don't see typically as many of like the yogis or just like sedentary people who don't really have like a driven movement practice in their life. So screening those types of things, you certainly can also call their clinic and talk to them. Most good providers, in my experience, would offer a free consult call, or will talk to you, prior to you coming in for care. It's certainly what we do. And so you can definitely ask them questions there. Questions you might ask are, what does a typical plan of care look like? Not only how many times and treatment days and whatever else, stuff like that, but like, what are we actually doing in each session? What's the first session look like? What do follow-up sessions look like? Stuff like that. Do you do a lot of treatment manual therapy wise or on the table, or do you do a lot of treatment movement wise? And if you are, like, movement wise, what are you doing? Asking them about the equipment they have in their space will tell you a lot about that. So again, if you're looking for like somebody who's gonna, you're a CrossFitter, you're a lifter, you're an athlete of some sort, lifting and doing stuff with your body, and you ask them like, hey, do you have dumbbells and kettlebells and maybe barbells in your clinic? And they say, no, I don't have any of those things. Well, maybe that's not going to be somebody that's aligned with your values. Or if they do say yes, say, okay, well, are they like the pink 3-pound dumbbells, or do you have, like, what weights do you have? How much weight do you actually have? And that'll be really telling as well.
I have yellow mini bands and
Yeah.
also green. Red flag.
Yes, that. Like, I have dumbbells up to 5 pounds, or maybe like 8, and I have yellow and red TheraBands, and we have one kettlebell, and it's pink, and it's from Walmart, and it weighs like 8 pounds, I think. Like, no.
Yes, this is not, these are not your people.
So all those things are very telling in my experience. And also, don't be afraid to fire the person you're working with, right? Like, if you think somebody's aligned, you go in for a visit or two or whatever, and it's like, this isn't really my jam, don't be afraid to fire them and work with somebody else.
I like that. That's great advice. Okay. I have one more major question before we get to like the important thing, which is moose. But I see this messaging mostly in Olympic weightlifters and powerlifters who basically pee on the platform. And then everyone kind of is like, that's okay. That's normal. But then the messaging is, it's not normal, but it is common. So that's sort of the messaging that's getting it out to that group now that, hey, go get your shit fixed. What kind of messaging could we use with firefighters just to sort of increase their awareness about pelvic floor? I think you hit on some of it, hip pain, back pain, etc., but kind of give us a line of messaging that we can use to get the word out.
Yep. So I'll borrow Christina Holland's language here.
Love her.
Yeah, she's awesome, especially for trauma informed care stuff. That's kind of her shtick. But yeah, so Christina Holland uses this wording, and I've kind of stolen that sense. Things are common, but not inevitable, right? So just because a lot of folks are having this doesn't mean that it's unavoidable, inevitable. You have to deal with these symptoms. Whether somebody chooses to deal with these symptoms or not is really super up to them. I've worked with folks and I've talked to folks, and I'm actually like, hey, that's your life. You get to do what you want with your body, right? But I've worked with folks that certainly are like, I have a little bit of urinary incontinence. It doesn't happen frequently enough or to a large enough like volume or intensity. It only happens every once in a while. I control it with like maybe they're wearing a pad or something, or an adult diaper, and that works for them. And they're like, you know what? Like, I don't need to invest the time and money. Maybe they have like traumas. A lot of people, statistically speaking, have like sexual and or physical traumas. And they're not ready to access care and work through that. Cool. Maybe that's serving them well. So, but common, but not inevitable, hold space for people to feel like, all right, cool. Like, I'm not the only one, but also I don't have to keep working through this or suffering with this. And also hold space for people who maybe don't want to address it yet. Right. So common, but not inevitable. And then something that's really helpful is the Cozine pelvic health screening tool. And that's Nicole Cozine's work. And it's basically a 10-question questionnaire. Check yes or no. Does this happen to you, or do you identify with a statement or not? And it asks questions like, have you ever had like a tailbone injury or things of that nature, basically. And so somebody who's like, well, maybe I have pelvic floor dysfunction, I don't know, can go through that and then check yes or no. And then I think it's 3 out of 10. If you check 3 out of 10 or more, you're super likely to have pelvic floor dysfunction and therefore things to work on. Literally not everybody has pelvic floor dysfunction. I thought I had a strong, healthy pelvic floor, and I went to some coursework when I first was learning stuff, and I have my own challenges. So, so thinking about that again, I was saying earlier, like, everybody has pelvic floor challenges until proven otherwise. Most of us do. And it can be something as simple as like constipation. And constipation is another thing. People are like, no, I'm not constipated. I'm like, oh, how long do you sit on the toilet for a bowel movement? oh, like, 10 or 15 minutes. I'm like, is that just scrolling time or are you actually trying to go? And they're like, oh no, I actually have to work for that long to actually pass a bowel movement. I'm like, you're constipated.
This is most of our firefighters, if we're being honest.
Almost everybody. And there's a lot of dietary stuff that goes on there as well. I know in the firehouse, but I'm thinking about your 3 bags of the same cheese being open right now, easy, but no. So there's a lot of challenges there as well with like diet and like health and wellness from that end of the spectrum too. But stress is one of the things that will cause your pelvic floor to be super tight and tense. Think about it, like people are aware of that in their neck and their shoulders and like being like super stressed there or clenching their jaw. Well, those areas are A, connected literally and neurologically to your pelvic floor, but B, if you have tightness in your shoulders and neck because of stress and strain and emotional trauma in your life, that's oftentimes happening with your pelvic floor as well. And so thinking about seeing the stuff that fire service men and women see and deal with on an almost daily basis, even if you want to say like they're micro traumas or trauma with a little t or whatever, there is emotional and psychological trauma almost every day there. Even just the perception and the awareness of like, hey, like this day might be my last because I might go on a call and not come back, or my friend might not, those type of things are certainly going to lend itself to things being a little bit more tense and tight and trying to kind of like our body's guarding and trying to protect. So I would posit that most of the fire service likely has pelvic floor challenges just based on even like the emotional and psychological strain they're under.
My bias has been confirmed. Just kidding. Listeners, we will link that. If you called it the Cozine questionnaire, is that right, Kyle?
Yep, Nicole Cozine.
We will link that questionnaire in the show notes so you can see it. So we're going to get rolling on, I guess, the outro here. Kyle is actually, bless his heart, sitting in his truck outside of the groomer, waiting for the real star of the family, who is Moose. So tell us about Moose, Kyle.
Moose is our golden doodle who just turned 1, so she's a year old, and she's a blue merle golden doodle. So everywhere we go, people ask what kind of dog she is, and we have to say golden doodle, and then they're like, but she's not like golden doodle colored. What is she? Because she's like black and gray and white. And yeah, we love her lots. And yeah, she's right now in the groomer because she's quite shaggy at this point in time. So she'll be looking fresh shortly here.
Fresh to death. And also Moose has her own Instagram handle, which is at Doodle Girl Moose. Is there an underscore in there, Kyle? I don't remember.
I don't either. I think there might be.
I'll put it in the show notes. All right, Kyle, if anyone listening today, their interest is piqued, they maybe want to get treated by you at Renegade, or maybe just have that, brief discovery call to suss out if whether they would be a good patient. How would you like people to get a hold of you?
Yep. So they can, there's a lot of different options. So I support patients through text. So certainly people can text or call the clinic number, which is 603-267-0432. Outside of that, you can certainly send us an email, info@renegademovementandperformance.com, all spelled out. I know that's long. I apologize. Trying to get Lex on that. Outside of that, you can contact us on social media as well, and at Renegade MVMT on Instagram, and I think it's at our MVMT on Facebook. And then I think that's the primary ways you can get in touch with us. Outside of that, you can certainly schedule as well. I can send AZ the link for the show notes for Jane. We use Jane app as a scheduler and a documentation software, and that allows folks to book right online. So super low barrier to entry there. You just click the link and click the appointment type you want and put in some information and find a time on a schedule and you're done.
We will get all of that information in the show notes for you. Okay, Kyle, if there's one thing that you would like to leave the listeners with that I didn't ask you, or if you would like to reiterate something, now is your time.
Yeah, I would say from the theme of our conversation, a lot of things are common but not inevitable. I'm not even just talking about pelvic health challenges now. I'm talking about like in general health and wellness challenges. A lot of things are common but not inevitable. And there is always going to be help and hope for you. It just might be a matter of finding the right person to help you with whatever is going on in your life and what your goals are, which sometimes can be a journey and sometimes is very challenging and defeating and frustrating. But there is somebody out there who is aligned with your goals, who does have the skills and the biases and expertise to help you get where you want to be, regardless of what the challenge is. So I just want everybody to kind of keep their eyes focused on that light at the end of the tunnel, because there is somebody there to help you. Again, it's just a matter of finding that right person.
I endorse this completely. You put that so well, Kyle. Well, with that, we are going to wrap up another episode of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. This has been AZ and Kyle, and we are most definitely out. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, AZ.